Victorian homes were full of deadly dangers. Why did everyday items kill so many? Hidden killers. In a quiet bedroom in London, on a damp morning in the 1860s, a young mother watches her second child die. The doctor cannot explain it. The first child died in the same room, in the same crib, beneath the same beautiful wallpaper. A wallpaper so admired that visitors often pause to compliment it. A vibrant, glowing emerald green, the most fashionable color of the age. The mother does not know that the walls themselves are killing her children. She will not know for years, and by the time anyone fully understands it, hundreds of thousands of homes across the empire will be decorated with the same silent poison. This is the strange, hidden tragedy of the Victorian household, a world of porcelain elegance and crushed velvet. A world where the most stylish home you could build was also, very often, the most lethal. And as we step into that world, three questions will follow us through every room. Why did so many seemingly healthy people fall ill in their own homes? Why did doctors take decades to identify what was killing them? And how did an entire civilization, proud of its progress, allow poison to become a fashion statement? Stay with this story carefully, because the truth unfolds slowly, just as it did for the Victorians themselves. To understand how it began, we have to leave the parlor for a moment and travel to a remote island in the South Atlantic, where one of history's most famous men was already dying from a force no one could see. The year is 1821. Napoleon Bonaparte, exiled to St. Helena, lies wasting in a small house called Longwood. He complains of stomach pain, of weakness, of a strange metallic taste. His skin yellows, his mind dulls. When he finally dies, the official cause is stomach cancer. But a century and a half later, scientists examining preserved locks of his hair would find something startling: arsenic, levels far above anything natural. The questions multiplied. Was he murdered, slowly poisoned by an enemy, or had something far stranger killed the Emperor of France? The answer, many researchers now believe, was hanging on his bedroom wall. The wallpaper at Longwood was a deep, fashionable green. Damp clung to the house in the island climate. And in damp conditions, that particular green released a toxic vapor. Napoleon may not have been murdered by a man. He may have been murdered by a room. Hold on to that idea, because it will return. The room itself as the killer. A simple decoration that smiled brightly while it slowly destroyed the people inside it. To grasp how this was possible, we have to go back even further, to a Swedish chemist whose curiosity would echo across continents and generations. His name was Carl Wilhelm Scheele. In 1775, while experimenting in his small laboratory, he discovered a new pigment. By combining copper with arsenic, he produced a green so brilliant, so alive, so unlike anything that had ever come before, that artists and manufacturers seized it almost overnight. He called it simply Scheele's green. The name belonged to him. The consequences would belong to the world. Within decades, that pigment had spread into paints, fabrics, candles, candies, children's toys, and most fatefully wallpaper. A more vivid version, sometimes called Paris green or emerald green, soon followed. It was even brighter, even more popular, even more poisonous. By the middle of the 19th century, it has been estimated that tens of millions of rolls of arsenic-laden wallpaper hung in British homes alone. Bedrooms, nurseries, drawing rooms, hospitals, schools. The color of nature hung indoors, killing quietly. But how could something so widely used remain so misunderstood? That brings us to one of the most uncomfortable truths of the era. The Victorians did not lack intelligence. They lacked a framework. They lived in a moment when industry moved faster than science, when factories produced miracles before anyone could measure their cost. A new chemical did not need to be tested. A new dye did not need to be approved. A manufacturer did not need to prove anything was safe. He only needed to prove people would buy it, and they did. They bought everything. Now picture the mother again, standing in that quiet bedroom. The wallpaper around her is alive in a way she cannot perceive. Microscopic particles flake off as the paper ages. In humid weather, mold grows behind it. And that mold transforms the arsenic compounds into a gas, a faint, almost odorless vapor that fills the room. She breathes it. Her children breathe it. The maid who dusts the room breathes it. Over months, over years, the body absorbs more than it can expel. Headaches, fatigue, stomach pains, a persistent cough. Children grew weaker, adults grew sicker. Doctors, baffled, prescribed fresh air, country visits, light diets, none of which address the source. And here lies the cruel irony. The treatment often worked, because when the patient left the room, they left the poison. When they returned, the symptoms returned with them. Yet for decades, no one connected the cause to the wall. While that mystery lingered, another category of hidden killer was already at work, and it operated in plain sight, on the faces of the women who used it. The Victorian beauty ideal demanded skin so pale it appeared almost translucent, a whiteness that signaled refinement, leisure, distance from the laboring sun. To achieve it, women of fashion turned to cosmetics that were, by any modern standard, slow-acting poisons. Lead-based face powders, sold under names that sounded like floral perfume, promised flawless porcelain skin. They delivered exactly that at first. With repeated use, however, the lead seeped through the skin and into the blood. The face that had once glowed with whiteness began to grey. The skin coarsened, hair fell out, teeth loosened, hands trembled. Some women, alarmed by the very symptoms the powder caused, applied still more powder to hide the damage, accelerating their own decline. Mercury appeared in skin creams meant to remove freckles and blemishes. Arsenic wafers, sold by mail order, were swallowed by the thousands by women who believed they would clear the complexion and bring a youthful bloom to the cheeks. They did, for a time. Arsenic dilates blood vessels close to the surface of the skin, producing a delicate pink flush that the era considered the height of feminine beauty. The cost of that flush was the slow corrosion of the kidneys, the liver, and the nervous system. Women who took the wafers reported feeling better, lighter, more radiant, until they did not, until they collapsed, until they died. And yet the most haunting thing is not what these substances did to the wealthy women who chose them. It is what they did to the working girls who never had a choice at all. We need to pause here, because this is one of those moments where the story shifts and the scale of suffering becomes visible. In a London workshop in 1861, a young woman named Matilda Schürer worked making artificial flowers. These flowers were used to decorate the hats, hairpieces, and gowns of fashionable ladies. To give the leaves their lifelike color, she dusted them with a fine green powder. That powder was almost pure copper arsenite, the same pigment that hung on the parlor walls of her customers. Matilda was 19 years old. She fell ill. Her vision blurred. Her gums swelled. She vomited a strange green water. The whites of her eyes turned green. Her fingernails turned green. When she died, doctors reported that even the inside of her body, examined after death, bore the unmistakable color of the substance that had killed her. Her case was reported in the medical press, and the public was briefly horrified. Articles appeared. Investigations were launched. It was discovered that the average ball gown decorated with arsenic green carried enough poison to kill several people. A single evening of dancing might shed enough toxic dust to sicken everyone in the room. And yet the dresses kept being made, the flowers kept being dusted, the wallpaper kept being printed. Why? This is the question we now have to confront. Because the answer is darker than ignorance. Many manufacturers knew, some knew very well. They had read the reports, they had seen the deaths, and they continued. Among them was a man whose name still hangs in museums today, celebrated as one of the greatest designers of his century, William Morris, the very father of modern decorative art, the visionary behind the arts and crafts movement, the creator of those rich, swirling botanical patterns that defined an era of taste. His company, Morris and Company, used arsenic pigments in many of its early wallpapers. And his family fortune, the wealth that made his entire artistic life possible, came in part from a Devon mine that produced one of the largest supplies of arsenic in the world. When concerns about arsenic in wallpaper began to spread, Morris dismissed them. He wrote with breathtaking certainty that the doctors raising the alarm had been bitten, in his words, by witch fever. He believed the danger was exaggerated. He believed his customers were safe. He was wrong. And it would take him years to quietly reformulate his pigments, never publicly admitting what had been there before. This pattern of denial layered on top of profit, layered on top of suffering, played out across the entire economy of the household. Consider the candles. In countless drawing rooms, decorative green candles burned through the long Victorian evenings. As they burned, they released arsenical fumes directly into the air. Consider the toys. Wooden soldiers, dolls, painted blocks, all colored with the same brilliant green pigments, handled by small fingers, brought to small mouths. Consider the curtains, the carpets, the upholstery, the artificial fruit displayed under glass domes on parlor tables, the green paper used to wrap meats and sweets at the grocer. Consider the food itself. In an age of rapid industrial production and almost no regulation, food adulteration was rampant. Pickles were colored with copper, cheeses were dyed with lead. Tea leaves, after being used once in better households, were collected, dried, recolored with toxic pigments, and resold to the poor. Sweets, the bright candies that delighted children, were sometimes tinted with lead chromate or other compounds whose only virtue was a vivid hue. This brings us to one of the most devastating incidents of the entire century, a moment when the hidden killers of Victorian life stepped fully into the light, and an entire town learned what they had been quietly tolerating. The place was Bradford, in northern England. The year was 1858. A confectioner named Joseph Neal was preparing a batch of peppermint humbugs, a popular hard candy. To stretch his ingredients and reduce his costs, he used a substance the trade quietly called daft, a cheap powder, often plaster of Paris or gypsum, used to bulk out the sugar. Neal sent an assistant to the local pharmacy to fetch a fresh supply. At the pharmacy, the regular druggist was ill, and a young assistant was minding the counter. Behind that counter, in unmarked containers, stood many substances. The assistant reached for what he believed to be the daft powder. He handed over instead 12 pounds of arsenic trioxide. Joseph Neal mixed it into his candy. The candy was sold at a market stall on a Saturday evening, 2 for a halfpenny. By morning, families across Bradford were gathered around the beds of dying children. More than 200 people fell violently ill. Around 20 died, most of them children. The investigation that followed revealed something the public had never fully grasped. Adulteration of food was not the exception. It was the rule. A respected analytical chemist named Arthur Hassall had already been documenting for years the staggering prevalence of toxic substances in everyday groceries. His findings had been printed in medical journals. They had been ignored. Bradford forced the country to look, and from that horror came the slow, reluctant beginning of food and drug regulation in the modern world. But notice the pattern again. It took mass death to prompt change. And even then, the change was incomplete. Wallpapers continued to be made with arsenic for years. Cosmetics continued to be sold with lead and mercury for decades. The Mad Hatter, that strange figure in the children's book, was a real medical phenomenon. Hat makers used mercury nitrate to soften animal furs into felt. The fumes attacked their nervous systems, causing tremors, hallucinations, paranoia, slurred speech, the long, slow disintegration of the mind. Whole communities of hatters in England, France, and the United States exhibited these symptoms. They were not eccentric. They were poisoned. We should now pause and remember the loops we opened at the beginning. The mother in the bedroom, the children dying without explanation. Some of those families, finally, did receive an answer, though it came too late to save the dead. By the 1870s and 1880s, physicians were beginning to publish unmistakable findings. Cases were documented in which entire households fell ill, and the only common factor was the green papered room. When the wallpaper was stripped, the symptoms vanished. When fresh identical paper was hung in another house, the symptoms appeared there. The connection became impossible to ignore. The German states moved earlier and more decisively, banning arsenical pigments in wallpaper before Britain did. In Britain, change came piecemeal, driven less by law than by consumer fear. Manufacturers began advertising their wallpaper as arsenic-free, the very fact of the advertisement an admission of what had come before. Some companies, including those connected to William Morris, slowly converted to safer pigments. The brilliant green slowly faded from fashionable rooms, replaced by softer, less alarming hues. Yet the deeper question remains. Why did it take so long? Part of the answer lies in the structure of Victorian medicine. Doctors were trained to identify acute illness, sudden, severe, dramatic, chronic, low-level poisoning, the kind that builds over months and mimics other ailments, was almost invisible to them. A patient who slowly grew weaker over a year was not poisoned. He was consumptive, he was nervous, he had a delicate constitution. The symptoms of arsenic exposure overlap with those of dozens of other conditions, and without modern toxicology, the connection was nearly impossible to make from a single case. It required pattern recognition across many cases, across many homes, across many years. It required the slow, patient work of statisticians and chemists. Part of the answer lies in commerce. The industries that produced these substances were enormously powerful. They employed thousands. They paid taxes. They advertised in the same newspapers that might have warned the public. To accuse them was to challenge a vast economic engine, and so the warnings, when they came, were quiet, buried in medical journals, whispered at dinner parties, mentioned, then dropped. And part of the answer lies in something more uncomfortable, in human nature itself. People do not easily believe that the things they love can hurt them. The Victorians loved their homes. They loved their fashions. They loved the brilliant, joyful colours that the new industrial chemistry had given them. To accept that those colours were killing their children meant accepting that their entire vision of progress, of refinement, of modern life, was built on a poisoned foundation. That is not a thought a society easily entertains. So instead, the deaths were absorbed into other categories. The child died of weakness, the mother died of nerves, the maid died of her station. The house, meanwhile, kept its colour and its quiet, and it kept its work. There is one more thread we have not yet pulled, and it ties the whole story together. The factory girls, the flower makers, the hatters, the dye workers, the miners who pulled arsenic and lead out of the earth in places like Devon and Cornwall. These were the invisible victims, the ones who suffered first and most severely, and whose suffering produced the goods that killed the people in the parlours. Some of them, like Matilda Scheurer, died spectacularly. Most died in obscurity. The historical record contains only fragments: a coroner's report, a factory inspector's note, an entry in a parish ledger. They are the foundation of the entire story, and they are the part of it most often forgotten. And so we return, at last, to the room, to that quiet bedroom, to the wallpaper that breathes, to the mother who does not yet understand what she is breathing. The story of the Victorian household is not a story of villains. It is a story of a civilization in love with itself, intoxicated by its own cleverness, building a beautiful world out of materials it did not understand. Every era does this in its own way. Every era surrounds itself with conveniences whose hidden costs will only be visible to the next generation. The Victorians had their arsenic green. We will have ours. The question is not whether they were foolish. The question is whether we are paying attention. By the dawn of the 20th century, regulation had finally caught up to the worst of these dangers. Food adulteration laws tightened. Cosmetics began to be tested. Industrial workers slowly gained protections, though many would die first to make those protections possible. The brilliant green pigments faded from production. The lead powders disappeared from the dressing tables of fashionable women. The mercury vanished from the hatters' workshops. But the houses themselves remained, and in some of them, in attics and back rooms, behind layers of newer paper and newer paint, the original Victorian walls still hide. Conservators who restore old houses sometimes find them, a flake of vivid green beneath a century of plaster, a shimmer of colour where it should not be. Almost 2 centuries old, and still, in chemical terms, dangerous. The poison did not die when its makers did. It is patient. It waits in the walls. Stand for a moment in one of those rooms in your imagination. Picture the heavy curtains, the gas lamps, the ticking clock on the mantelpiece, the children's small shoes by the fire. Picture the mother and her sleeping child. Picture the wallpaper, its pattern of leaves and tendrils, its impossible green, the proudest decoration in the house. Now picture what no one in the room can see, the slow drift of particles in the lamplight, the faint exhalation of the walls. The quiet work of chemistry that has been turning beauty into death since the moment the paper was hung. This is what it meant to live in the most modern home of the 19th century. This is the dark inheritance of an age that mistook brilliance for safety, novelty for goodness, and elegance for truth. And if these forgotten histories speak to you, if you find yourself drawn to the stories the textbooks left out, stay with us, because there are many more rooms in this house and many more secrets still waiting behind their walls. The Victorians believed they had built a paradise of progress. In some ways, they had. In other ways, they had built something far stranger. A world in which the safest thing in the room was sometimes the only thing not yet invented. A world in which the greatest danger was the one you had grown to love. A world that, in the end, taught the rest of us a lesson it had to die to learn. And the lesson is this: look closely at the things you trust. Look closely at the comforts you take for granted. Because somewhere, even now, in a color you admire or a product you cannot live without, the next hidden killer is already waiting to be found.